It's great to see, as Mike said, such a turnout here for the IPCC process, or for this meeting, to, I suppose, hopefully clarify some of the mysteries that Mike has alluded to behind the IPCC and how it works. Basically, what I'm going to do is just run through the IPCC structures, how it interfaces with governments, and what is to be expected from the 6th assessment cycle, which we've just kicked off, I suppose, over the last year or so. The IPCC is quite an interesting organisation in terms of it's very unique. Sorry, there's been a bit of a cover-up of some of the information there, but it was actually established in 1988 by the WMO and UNEP at the time. And it was established because those organisations recognised that there was a need to have an authoritative assessment of the science of climate change and what response options should be progressed. The membership is 195 member governments. Those are the member governments of the WMO and UNEP. Its mandate is to provide scientific understanding of climate change itself, the physical basis, the impacts of climate change and adaptation options, and then mitigation of climate change through addressing greenhouse gas emissions. It also has another very important function, and that is to provide governments with good practice guidelines in how to assess their greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And those good practice guidelines are highly detailed recipe books, methodologies that are used, for instance, by my colleagues who do the national inventory, which is reported every year. And that inventory is used, the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, that inventory is reported to the EU and UN, and is used for compliance with to assess compliance with various targets we have established. You can say the role of IPCC can be stated in the two principles of its that govern its work. And the first one of those is to assess on a comprehensive, objective, open and transparent basis the scientific, technical and socio-economic information relative to understanding the scientific basis of human-induced climate change, its potential impacts and options for adaptation and mitigation. So that is in a nutshell what the IPCC does in its assessment reports and other reports. And the IPCC report should be neutral with respect to policy. The IPCC doesn't tell policymakers what the policy should be. It provides objective facts but they should be policy relevant but not policy prescriptive. As Mike said, the first report was produced in the 80s, the first assessment report, and that report was instrumental in formation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was formed in 1990. The second assessment report was key to the formation or agreement of the the Kyoto Protocol. The third assessment report can be said, I suppose, to have instigated the process by which the 2-degree limit was first adopted at the Copenhagen meeting. The fourth assessment report was the fourth assessment report was the one that led to the 2-degree limit being adopted at Copenhagen. It was also the one which the IPCC got the Nobel Prize for then ahead of the Copenhagen Agreement. The fifth assessment report, which was completed in 2014, was central to the Paris Agreement, or agreement of the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, which we're now working on. And I suppose we've moved on to the next phase now of the sixth assessment report and its products, and in each of those, just to say, in each of those assessment cycles, the IPCC sort of changes. Each cycle, all the members, the top members of the IPCC are re-elected or reconsidered. So there's a whole change process each time around. I suppose that adds a bit to the mystery, in that people don't stay there forever. They move on quite rapidly. And reasons for that, it's a very demanding process. And after a 5 or 6 year writing process, a lot of people are exhausted and don't feel like continuing on really in that type of activity. So how is it structured? The IPCC plenary, which involves all of the the member governments is the deciding body. The plenary, when it's not in session, has the IPCC Bureau, and the Bureau is made up of the chair and other top members of the IPCC, including the co-chairs of the working groups. And beneath that is an executive committee which looks after day-to-day running of the IPCC, and that's facilitated by the Secretariat, which is based in Geneva. Then each of the working groups, it has 3 working groups. Working Group 1 deals with the physical science basis, and each of those working groups will have a technical support unit. Working Group 2 deals with climate change impacts and adaptation and vulnerability, and Working Group 3 deals with mitigation of climate change. So as each of those working groups has a technical support unit, which is essentially a secretariat and expert support systems, and those are funded by the hosting governments and they're not based in Geneva. Then you have the task force on national greenhouse gas inventories. Again, it has 2 co-chairs and it has got its own TSU. And then underneath all of that is all of the authors, contributors, reviewers, etc., who do the key work. So that's an overview of the panel. Those of you with eagle eyes may be able to see me there, but you get a prize if you do. That was a picture from Geneva. That's plenary session. From Nairobi. The structure, as it's now constituted for the 6th assessment cycle, is based on, we have the chair Hwasong Lee from Korea. Then you have 3 vice chairs, Thelma Krug from Brazil, Yuba Sakona from Malawi, and Co Barrett from the USA. And then over each of the working groups, you have Working Group 1, Valerie Masson Delmotte, and Panmao Zhai, is that his name, from China. Working Group 2 is co-chaired by Hans Portner from Germany and Deborah Roberts from South Africa. Working Group 3 is co-chaired by Jim Skee from the UK and Prandishi Sukala from India. And then the task force on inventories is co-chaired by Kyoto Tanabe from Japan and Eduardo Calvo from Peru. As you can see, there's 2 co-chairs for each of the working groups, one from the developing country and one from the developed country. And basically, the governments of France, Germany, and the UK have offered to the IPCC their resources in doing this. So this is an investment, a multi-million euro or pound investment by each of those countries to set up the TSU and to employ the necessary staff to manage the IPCC, the work of the working groups, and similarly from Japan. So this, as I said, the Secretariat is based in Geneva. It oversees the management of IPCC activities, liaises with member governments, organises meetings and manages the trust fund. The IPCC is not funded in the same way as other UN bodies. It actually has a trust fund which governments make voluntary contributions to. And just to note, the biggest contributor to the IPCC to date has been the USA. They've contributed more than half of the annual running costs, I would say, of the IPCC. That may not continue, so there's some questions as to the future funding of the IPCC, and that'll be an interesting issue that will obviously evolve over time. And then it coordinates its outreach activities, some of which, when the IPCC was here earlier this year, there was a few events. There was an event in UCD, an event in the IEA, which was supported by the IPCC Secretariat. So the key products from the IPCC are the assessment reports that I mentioned. These are, as Mike said, they used to be about 300 pages. They're now about 400 or 500 pages per volume, and they all add up to an awful lot of effort, an awful lot of information. The methodologies reports on greenhouse gas inventories. They also produce special reports, which are shorter, more focused reports, produced over a 2 to 3 year time period, and technical papers, which are just syntheses of key information from the major reports. As I said, the assessment reports, they provided over 6 to 7 years. It consists of the three main reports and a synthesis report. And the special reports are over a 2 to 3 year period, produced over a 2 to 3 year period. Each of those reports will have a summary for policymakers. Policymakers, as you know, don't like big volumes. They only like key messages, short, succinct statements. So the summary for policymakers is about 20 to 30 pages, and even at that, your average policymakers prefer it at 1 or 2 pages. So essentially what the IPCC is doing is taking the vast amount of knowledge that's published in the literature and synthesizing it, assessing it, bringing it together, communicating it to policy. But policy is the highest level, as I said. The IPCC has led to the formation of the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement. And as Mike said, those are the sort of reports that's done in the past. 5 assessment reports has been produced, 9 special reports, guidelines on greenhouse gas inventories, and 6 technical papers. So there's a vast amount of work has gone into producing these, from the science up to the production of these reports. For the 6th assessment report, the key output, the assessment report it has already been decided that it will inform the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. And those of you who are familiar with the Paris Agreement will know that the process there has slightly different than, for instance, under the Kyoto Protocol, where specific targets were agreed. Under the Paris Agreement, each of the countries will do their nationally determined contributions, and what will happen in 2023 is there will be a stocktake. Are these nationally determined contributions, do they add up to achieving the mitigation reductions that are required, for instance, to meet the below 2 degree target, which was adopted in the Paris Agreement? They'll also look at issues such as the adaptation goal and the means of implementation, such as on financial flows. It's also agreed in this cycle to produce 3 special reports, one on warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. So that report was requested from the Paris Agreement, so that's been done in a rush because that has to be produced for 2018 to inform what is called a facilitative dialogue. And so that is really stretching the IPCC, because the IPCC has very intricate and very strict review processes by experts and government. So that process has already started and is underway in terms of getting text together for that 1.5 degree report, because the turnover will be so rapid by IPCC standards. Then what was just agreed there 2 weeks ago in the IPCC plenary meeting in Guadalajara was the scoping for a special report on land, and Ireland was very strong on having this particular report. When it says land, it's not just land, it's deserts, it's agriculture, it's food production. So it's something of key global and national interest, I would have said. And we did host a scoping meeting for that particular report. The scoping meeting itself is where the scientists get together, the scientists come up with an outline, that then goes to the plenary, and the plenary will tinker with it, I suppose. They won't really rewrite it, but they will suggest modifications. So there's a dialogue there at the outset between the scientific community and governments as to what the scope, how it could be improved in order to facilitate the policymakers. The other key report to be produced is special report is on oceans and cryosphere, and the scoping for that took place in Monaco, and again that was agreed in Guadalajara. Oceans, again, Ireland has very specific interest in the ocean. We're an island nation. Our coastal areas are vulnerable to sea level rise, and obviously the oceans themselves are changing due to climate change. The cryosphere obviously is one of the changes the changes to the cryosphere are changing the oceans as well. Obviously you have to think about glaciers and the poles as what's happening there in terms of the changing cryosphere, which for particular regions with mountainous areas is very critical in terms of their water supply and security. And as I said, there's a refinement of good practice guidelines also being produced, and that will explore areas where there's new science and new technologies, and one of those new technologies, I suppose, has been this novel ways to extract fossil fuel, I suppose better known as fracking. How are the governments involved? The governments, as I said, constitute the panel which agrees to the reports to be produced for each cycle and their scope, even though there's a dynamic between the researchers and the scientific community and the governments in finally agreeing that. They nominate experts to serve as authors, experts as reviewers, and they provide review editors. So they review the second order draft. They don't see the first order draft. The first order draft will just go to the experts, and they provide comments on that. And then at the final plenary, the governments will go through the summary for policymakers line by line. So there will be a very intense dialogue over almost a week between what does this mean? What are you trying to say in this particular line? How does this all fit together in the overall messages? What is the science really trying to tell policymakers? So that is the final sign-off process. The government, once that stage, there's no changes made to the underlying documents. Some of you may be familiar that Saudi Arabia were not happy with some of the contents of the Working Group 3 report that pointed to the growth in emissions from some emerging economies. So that was, eventually it was removed from the summary for policymakers, but all the underlying analysis was maintained in the full report and was available for use. All of the people are involved in the authorship, from the chair to the vice chairs, co-chairs, working group chairs, and for the fifth assessment report, we had about 135 authors and review editors from 85 countries. They're selected by the Bureau. We're going to talk about the nomination process, but what happens is governments send in the names of experts. The Bureau, the IPCC Bureau, those people that I showed the pictures of, plus the vice chairs, there's about 8 vice chairs for each working group, will do the final selection of the people to write the report. And there will be the expert reviews, about 2,000 expert reviews of the 2,000 experts reviewed the AR5 as expert reviewers. So as I said, the review process, internal reviews of the first draft. The first order draft goes to experts. Second order draft goes to governments and experts, and then approval adoption of the final report of the summary for policymakers by the panel. And there was over 140,000 review comments were received for the fifth assessment report. And all of those comments, they're all categorized, they're all listed, and if you want to see the answers to why your comment was taken on board or not taken on board, you can go into the IPCC archive and find those comments and find out who said them and how they were treated. So that's it in a nutshell. We have the scoping, approval of the outline, nomination of authors, start writing, first order draft, second order draft, goes to government, approval and acceptance of the report, and then the report is used by governments, particularly in international fora, but obviously the reports are useful at national level and local level and by businesses as well. And that's it. For further information, should have been, the website is there, ipcc.ch.